David's world is what we work for. He'd tell no lies that lead us to war. No drones or sanctions to prove we can score. In David's world, there'd be war no more. Fear would not rule. Fear tears us apart. Justice and peace would be state-of-the-art. No NSA, CIA, or TPP would threaten to stop us from being free. We, the people, would choose who should lead, not one-percenters with their Gothic greed. The war economy would at last end. The world would correctly see us as a friend. And when the war economy ceased to exist, the positive changes are such a long list. If David were president, but wait just a minute. How could he change things with this Congress in it? This same slimy Congress that's bought and paid for. It's hard to find one who's not a war whore. And the Supreme Court kills, and as the Supreme Court kills our Constitution, the executive branch is sure no solution. And how can the Senate claim their seniority when they don't even know 51 is a majority? Time to look elsewhere to leaders who dare, fearless heroes who know all and care. Leaders to pull us out of this mire, leaders whose truth-telling lights up our fire. Leaders who helps us stay in the game. There's one here tonight, and you know his name. Put your hands together and send up a cheer. David Swanson, our mentor, come on up here.
When we start talking about ending war, one common reaction, not as common as you're a lunatic, but fairly common, is to propose that if we want to get rid of war, we will have to get rid of something else first. Or sometimes it's a series of something else's. We'll have to get rid of bankers or bribery, or the current structure of our government, or the corporate media monopoly. We'll have to get rid of racism or bigotry or extreme materialism. We'll have to abolish capitalism or environmental exploitation or religion or greed or resource shortages or sociopaths. And then we'll be able to move on to abolishing war. Now, I think there's truth and falsehood in a lot of these two-step proposals. War is made easier by many evil things. Ending war would be easier if we ended those things. Ending war and some other things together might be an easier job because of the broader coalition it would bring together to work on it. And I'm in favor of ending a lot of bad things: racism, bribery, predatory capitalism, mass incarceration, the White House Correspondents' Dinner, etc. And I would be, even if doing so didn't help end war. But war is not made necessary by anything else. The United States has roughly 5% of the world's population and 50% of the world's military spending. Many nations spend 10%, 5%, or less than what the United States spends on war. But they don't have only 5% of the racism or 5% as many sociopaths, however you define those. Nations with plenty of bigotry and serious resource shortages manage to nonetheless avoid U.S. levels of war investment, whether measured absolutely or as a percentage of wealth. The U.S. media at the moment seems to care about burned Nigerians more than burned Ukrainians. Racism can serve imperialism. It can also be trumped by imperialism. In addition, if you look at particular wars launched and possible wars not launched, it becomes clear that the decisions are entirely contingent on human choices. When a particular war is stopped, the lesson we ought to take away is not that the forces of consumerism and capitalism and exploitation will build up greater pressure, making it more likely that another war will soon be launched. The lesson we ought to take away, on the contrary, is that because one war has been stopped, the next war can be stopped as well, and 100 after that one. I'm a big fan of the journalist Seymour Hersh, including of the help he's been in exposing the fraudulent case that was built up to support a White House proposal last summer for missile strikes on Syria, and the help he's been in exposing the massive scale of the attack that was being contemplated. Some of us had figured out, all on our own, that when Secretary of State John Kerry said the missile strikes would shift the balance in the war and be so small as to not affect the war whatsoever, at least one of those two assertions had to be wrong. It turns out that the plan was for a major assault, not a tiny one. What the result would have been, nobody can be sure, beyond widespread death, injury, trauma, and suffering. 2 wings of B-52 bombers carrying 2,000-pound bombs were to take out, quote, electric power grids, oil and gas depots, all known logistic and weapons depots, all known command and control facilities, and all known military and intelligence buildings. This was not a few missiles. This was shock and awe, targeting numerous facilities in densely populated urban areas. If you need an example of the Obama White House immediately expanding a war like this one once begun, the obvious example is Libya. But when Hersh writes and talks about what went on back in August and September, he doesn't seem to even consider the possibility that public pressure might have played even the slightest role in preventing the missile strikes. Democracy Now! Interviewed Hersh and didn't raise the topic. And I don't mean to pick on Seymour Hersh or Democracy Now! Nobody else has done any different. A friend of mine, a former CIA officer, Ray McGovern, has been doing great writing about Syria. He, like Hersh, considers the steps taken by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Congress, the President, the Russians. Nowhere is the public mentioned. Now, even if the public played no role whatsoever, that fact in itself would be worthy of serious consideration. Members of both houses of Congress from both parties said that they heard more from their constituents on the missiles into Syria proposal than they had ever before heard on anything else, and that what they heard was more one-sided than anything they'd ever experienced. If the public had no impact, or if Congress had no impact, the scale of the pretense otherwise, and the possible futility of ever lobbying Congress on anything would make for a remarkable story. Virtually, this entire country was opposed to the missile strikes. Add to that the fact that Congress members were on break and being directly confronted at district town hall meetings, accused of joining a war on the side of Al-Qaeda. It didn't hurt that Jewish holidays were going on and AIPAC was missing in action. It was an advantage that many people in the halls of power were themselves reluctant to launch a war. But why were they? Why were members of Congress stating that they didn't want to be the guy who voted for another Iraq war? Why did the House of Commons oppose a prime minister on war for the first time since Yorktown? Why did the conversation swing away from missile strikes? President Obama and his Secretary of State were telling us to watch YouTubes of suffering children and support that suffering or support missile strikes. Not exactly a half-hearted sales pitch. Wall Street was completely sold. Raytheon, the company that made the missiles, saw its stock hit an all-time high. The leaders of both big political parties were on board. The corporate news outlets were gung-ho. John Kerry was calling Bashar al-Assad a new Adolf Hitler. The illegality of the proposal was hardly a blip in the conversation, the way it might have been before Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and the drone wars. Illegality has become the new normal. Russia and Syria came up with a solution, but they'd been willing to do that for some time. President Obama allowed Congress to have a say, as he had not on Libya, and does not on most drone strikes. We all, including the Congress itself, pretend that it's up to the president to allow Congress to have a say. But why did he? I think it can help to contrast the war and peace climate of 2013 with a different imaginary one. And I proposed this to Ray McGovern, and he completely agreed. Imagine that the wars on Afghanistan and Iraq were considered the peak of U.S. glory, were routinely celebrated, were what everyone had come to hope for as the ideal outcomes of all future wars. Imagine that those who voted against the war on Iraq were shamed and shunned and forced to defend their mistake. Imagine 90% of the country, instead of 5 or 10%, favored every new war proposal. Imagine that doubt of new assertions about chemical weapons use or other supposed reasons for wars was unheard of. Imagine crowds chanting their demands for more wars, bigger wars, more costly wars, greater destruction, more extravagant atrocities. Imagine the phones in Washington ringing off the hook and the online petitions flooding in with a demand for war rather than the demand to avoid wars. In such a climate, would the balance have tipped the little bit that it tipped, bumping war, which is never a last resort, from the position of second resort to the position of second resort from first resort, where it had been the day before? Now, to claim that public pressure, both over the past decade and immediately, may have had some impact is not to reject other factors. This was a horribly timed, horribly marketed war that any self-respecting member of the world's second oldest profession, war propaganda, should be ashamed of. Another war might have been harder to stop. Nor would it be right to claim a complete victory, with the U.S. government continuing to arm and train and support fighters in that war, and with no investment in humanitarian aid and diplomacy or nonviolent peace workers to match the public demand. The crisis in Syria rolls on, reinforcing the ridiculous notion that if you aren't going to bomb a country, there's nothing else you can do for it. But the resolution of the Syrian missile crisis, like the blocking of a sanctions and possible war on Iran bill earlier this year, suggests possible victories to come, as well as suggesting that no underlying force makes any war inevitable. Now, if I had to pick a factor to eliminate, in hopes that war would be eliminated as well, and if I had the magical ability to effectively eliminate any factor I chose, I think I would pick, rather than bigotry or greed, the factor of dishonesty. While you can have dishonesty without war, you cannot have war without dishonesty. You can have lies about other, much smaller public programs: police, schools, parks, courts, housing, agriculture, research, environmental protection, diplomacy. But you can also create and fund such programs without lying about them. In contrast, there is no example of an honest war, and there's reason to believe that there cannot be one. This isn't new, and it extends as far back as historical records, probably farther. Enemies are dehumanized. Threats and abuses are invented or exaggerated. Victims in need of rescue or protection or vengeance are airbrushed or pulled out of thin air. Victory is always right around the corner, and if nothing is accomplished, the war is glorified as an end in itself. This country began with these lies about Native Americans. In 1812, among other occasions, Canada was depicted as eager to be liberated. Then Mexico was falsely said to have invaded the United States. Spain was said to have blown up the Maine. President Wilson pretended the troops and arms on the Lusitania had not been public knowledge. The Gulf of Tonkin incident launched war on Vietnam despite never happening. The Gulf War began 2 decades of devastation for Iraq after a completely fictional skit created by a public relations company pretended babies had been taken out of incubators. These are not exceptions. Every war requires such lies about fake motives and omissions of real motives, as well as lies about how the war is proceeding. One-sided slaughters of civilians on a scale that ancient and medieval wars couldn't approach are depicted as sporting contests on battlefields in which the aggressor suffers. Polls find a majority in the United States believing Iraqis benefited from the war that destroyed Iraq, and America suffered. That lie is more dangerous than the WMD lies ever were. Lies about the glory of World War I after 100 years of war failing to end all war. Lies about victory in Korea and nobility in Vietnam. These are major undertakings of our governments for a reason. A central lie for war makers is the pretense of working for peace. The United States worked for a breakup of Yugoslavia, intentionally prevented negotiated agreements among the parties, and engaged in a massive bombing campaign 15 years ago that killed large numbers of people, injured many more, destroyed civilian infrastructure and hospitals and media outlets, and created a refugee crisis that did not exist until after the bombing had begun. This was accomplished through lies, fabrications, and exaggerations about atrocities, and then justified anachronistically as a response to violence that it generated.